One struggles to know where to begin with Ben Shapiro, not because the material is scarce, but because the embarrassment of riches proves almost paralyzing. Here we have a man who has managed to construct an entire media empire upon the twin pillars of speaking very quickly and being consistently, spectacularly wrong about nearly everything that matters. Mr. Shapiro, an attorney who abandoned legal practice after merely 10 months, discovered that there was considerably more money to be made in the grievance industry than in the tedious business of actual jurisprudence. He became a nationally syndicated columnist at 17, an achievement that tells us rather more about the declining standards of American journalism than about any particular precocity on his part. The gentleman styles himself as a paragon of logic and reason, forever bleating about how facts don't care about your feelings. Yet when subjected to actual scrutiny by BBC's Andrew Neil, a noted conservative, mind you, Shapiro stormed out of the interview like a petulant child denied dessert, telling his interrogator, "I'm popular and no one has ever heard of you," before later admitting on Twitter that Neil had destroyed him. One can only marvel at the combination of ignorance and arrogance required to travel to Britain and confidently declare that Andrew Neil is an obscure leftist. It's rather like visiting France and asking, "Who's this de Gaulle fellow?" The man performed an intellectual self-immolation on live television, then had to return home and explain to his followers why he'd called one of Britain's most prominent conservative journalists a leftist hack. The second-hand embarrassment is almost physically painful. But let us turn to matters of substance, or what passes for it in Shapiro's universe. On the matter of climate science, he has suggested that people worried about rising sea levels consuming coastal property should simply sell their homes and move. One is forced to ask, sell them to whom, precisely? Does Mr. Shapiro imagine a robust real estate market for properties currently serving as habitat for confused fish? Is there some hitherto undiscovered demographic of homebuyers enthusiastically shopping for underwater mortgages? This is the intellectual equivalent of solving hunger by suggesting the poor simply eat cake, except at least Marie Antoinette had the excuse of being 14 years old and catastrophically sheltered. Shapiro is a grown man with a law degree who apparently believes that market economics can overcome the laws of physics. His views on human sexuality and gender would be risible if they weren't so cruel. Shapiro has repeatedly stated that transgender individuals suffer from mental illness, directly contradicting the American Psychological Association. But then, what would medical professionals know compared to a man whose primary qualification is talking quickly into a microphone? During a 2015 television appearance, after repeatedly misgendering a transgender woman and calling her "sir" with the sneering delight of a schoolyard bully, the guest placed her hand on his neck. Shapiro's response? He filed a police report and stated he intended to teach the left a lesson. Imagine being so utterly fragile, so comprehensively pathetic, that you require police intervention after being touched on the shoulder during an argument you yourself provoked through calculated disrespect. This is a man who fashions himself a brave warrior for free speech, yet runs crying to the authorities the moment someone responds to his provocations with the mildest physical contact. One thinks of Dostoevsky's observation that nothing is easier than to denounce the evildoer, nothing is more difficult than to understand him, except Shapiro manages to make even denunciation look difficult, requiring state protection to do it. But perhaps nothing captures Shapiro's essential ridiculousness quite like his infamous commentary on Cardi B's WAP. After robotically reciting the lyrics with all the erotic appeal of a tax return being read at a funeral, and denouncing the song as anti-feminist, Shapiro revealed that he had consulted his wife, a doctor, as he never tires of mentioning, as though it somehow compensates for his own intellectual inadequacies, who diagnosed the condition described in the song as potentially indicating bacterial vaginosis or a yeast infection. Let us pause here to appreciate the full horror of this moment. Shapiro, in his eagerness to appear medically informed and morally superior, announced to the entire world that he has never successfully aroused his own wife. Not once, not ever. The self-own was so complete, so devastating, so utterly annihilating, that it achieved a kind of horrible perfection. It was as though a man had called a press conference specifically to inform the world that he doesn't know how to tie his own shoes. Millions of people gleefully pointed out that female sexual arousal is, in fact, not a medical emergency requiring intervention from a physician. But Shapiro, in his limitless capacity for revealing his own inadequacies, had managed to transform a song about sexual pleasure into an inadvertent confession of conjugal incompetence. One struggles to imagine the conversation in the Shapiro household. "Darling, I've been analyzing this popular music, and I'm concerned these women may need medical attention." "Why is that, dear?" "Well, they describe a level of vaginal lubrication that seems abnormal." At which point Mrs. Shapiro, a medical professional, could have explained basic human physiology to her husband, but apparently chose instead to confirm his suspicions, perhaps out of a desire to avoid an even more uncomfortable conversation about their own intimate life. The mind recoils. On matters of race and ethnicity, Shapiro's record moves from the farcical to the sinister. In 2010, he tweeted that Israelis like to build, Arabs like to bomb crap and live in open sewage. Read that again, slowly, let it sink in. This is a statement that could have been lifted directly from the pages of Der Stürmer, differing only in its target. One thinks of the historical libels against Jewish people themselves, that they were inherently dirty, that they poisoned wells, that they were by nature destructive and parasitic. These vile slanders were used to justify everything from pogroms to the Holocaust. Yet here is Shapiro, presumably aware of this history, deploying precisely the same dehumanizing rhetoric against another Semitic people. The statement reveals a worldview in which entire populations can be reduced to bestial caricatures, in which millions of human beings, with their own dreams, sorrows, loves, and aspirations, can be dismissed as collectively preferring to live in filth and violence. It is the logic that has preceded every genocide, every ethnic cleansing, every campaign of systematic dehumanization. The Hutus told themselves the Tutsis were cockroaches. The Ottomans convinced themselves the Armenians were an existential threat. The Nazis produced elaborate pseudo-scientific theories about Jewish inferiority. And here is Ben Shapiro, educated at Harvard Law School no less, casually suggesting that Arabs possess some intrinsic preference for squalor and destruction. His subsequent attempts to clarify that he was referring only to Palestinian leadership fooled precisely no one with functioning eyes or a basic grasp of the English language. The tweet itself makes no such distinction. It says Arabs, not some Palestinian militants or certain extremist groups, or even the governments of Hamas and Hezbollah, just Arabs, as in all of them, as in hundreds of millions of people stretching from Morocco to Iraq, as in one of the world's great civilizations that was preserving Greek philosophy and advancing mathematics and astronomy, while Shapiro's European ancestors were still figuring out basic sanitation. More recently, when asked about the deaths of over 40,000 people during the Gaza conflict, Shapiro stated that he doesn't just condone the actions of the Israeli government, he celebrates and lauds them. Here we see the ultimate moral bankruptcy of a man who wraps himself in the rhetoric of Judeo-Christian values while celebrating what much of the world views as a humanitarian catastrophe. 40,000 people, and Shapiro celebrates. Among them, according to the United Nations, thousands upon thousands of children, bodies pulled from rubble, families obliterated, entire residential buildings reduced to smoking craters, and Benjamin Shapiro lauds this, celebrates it, finds in it cause for moral satisfaction. One recalls that during the height of the British Empire's most brutal suppression of colonial rebellions, there were at least some in Parliament who expressed discomfort, who questioned whether the violence was proportionate or just. During the American campaign in Vietnam, even ardent anti-communists eventually had to grapple with photographs of napalmed children and villages reduced to ash. But Shapiro has no such qualms. He doesn't merely defend these actions as regrettable necessities in a complex conflict. He celebrates them enthusiastically, publicly, proudly. This is the same man who lectures endlessly about the superiority of Western civilization and its respect for human life and dignity. The same man who positions himself as a defender of moral clarity against moral relativism. Yet when confronted with the deaths of tens of thousands, including enormous numbers of civilians and children, his response is not sorrow, not even the grim acknowledgement of tragic necessity, but celebration. One wonders what exactly he imagines he is celebrating. The precise moment when a missile strike turns a child into a pink mist. The specific instant when a family of 6 becomes a scattered collection of body parts. These are not abstractions. These are human beings who loved and feared and hoped, snuffed out, and Ben Shapiro celebrates. Shapiro resigned from Breitbart in 2016 after the organization failed to support a reporter who had been assaulted, a moment of apparent principle that is somewhat undermined by the fact that he had spent the previous 4 years happily working for an outlet that specialized in exactly the kind of inflammatory, divisive content that made such an environment possible in the first place. This is rather like a long-time employee of a slaughterhouse suddenly discovering moral qualms when a colleague gets injured on the killing floor, while having previously been perfectly content with the daily business of industrial-scale butchery. Yes, how brave of him to discover that Breitbart promoted thuggish behavior only after he'd already cashed years of paychecks from them. The man who claims to champion reason and civil discourse has blamed a rise in suicide among young people on what he calls indoctrination by the LGBTQ+ community, despite actual research showing precisely the opposite, that gender-affirming healthcare lowers rather than increases suicide rates among transgender youth. But why let peer-reviewed research interfere with a good culture war talking point? Why concern yourself with the actual lives of actual vulnerable young people when you can score points with your audience by suggesting that the real problem is that society has become too accepting? This is the particular poison Shapiro peddles. He takes vulnerable populations already at heightened risk of self-harm and tells his millions of followers that these people are being indoctrinated, that their identities are delusions, that accommodating them represents a threat to civilization itself. And when some of these young people, bullied, rejected, told by prominent voices that their very existence is a symptom of social decay, take their own lives, Shapiro blames it on the people trying to help them rather than on the culture of rejection and denigration he himself promotes. It's rather like setting fire to an orphanage and then blaming the fire department for not arriving quickly enough. One thinks of the sad history of medical experts who insisted that homosexuality was a mental illness, that it could and should be cured, and who subjected countless individuals to barbaric conversion therapies, electroshock treatments, and chemical castration. Decades later, we recognize this as one of the great moral stains on medical history, the systematic persecution of vulnerable people disguised as healthcare. Yet here is Shapiro, with his law degree and his talk radio platform, attempting to resurrect these same arguments with a slightly different target population, apparently having learned nothing from history's judgment of his ideological predecessors. What we have in Ben Shapiro is the consummate product of our degraded age, a man of distinctly modest intellect who has discovered that in the attention economy, volume and velocity can substitute for wisdom and depth. He speaks rapidly, not because he has so much of value to say, but because the speed makes it difficult to notice how little substance there is beneath the performance. He is forever destroying college students in viral videos, which is rather like bragging about beating children at chess. Yes, Ben, congratulations. You've had 20 years to rehearse your talking points, and you managed to fluster a 19-year-old with 3 minutes to formulate a response. Truly, this is the mark of a great intellect. The man is a provincial boor dressed up in the costume of an intellectual, a second-rate mind given first-rate platforms, a moral pygmy who has convinced himself he stands on elevated ground. He trades in the most shop-worn sophistry, the most tired reactionary cliches, delivered with an unearned confidence that would be admirable if it weren't so transparently hollow. He is what stupid people imagine a smart person sounds like, and what cruel people imagine a moral person sounds like. One would pity him, were he not so obviously pleased with himself, were he not so richly rewarded for his puerile provocations, were he not doing real harm to real people through his cynical manipulation of cultural anxieties. But as it stands, Benjamin Shapiro represents something rather darker than mere harmless foolishness. He is a case study in how a culture in decline will elevate its most aggressive mediocrities to positions of prominence, mistaking rage for reason and confusing the ability to speak quickly with having something worth saying. In the end, he is precisely what he accuses others of being, a purveyor of feelings masquerading as facts, an ideologue disguised as a logician, a man who has built an empire not on truth, but on telling a certain kind of person exactly what they want to hear, delivered at a pace too rapid to allow for reflection or doubt. He is, in short, a fraud, but a peculiarly successful one, which tells us less about his talents than about the appetites of his audience and the poverty of our discourse. One would say that history will not be kind to him, but that suggests history will remember him at all.